So let's continue our studies. By now we should have timed out our session, so we'll refresh to get a new session going here. And in this section, let's talk about schedules as they apply to firewall rules. So schedules for rules, of course. This is a feature provided by enterprise class firewalls. And this particular feature features the following: time-based filtering, which allows us to filter traffic based on the time of day or a range of time, a block of time. It adds criteria to basic rule. So for any of the ports for which we've already permitted traffic, we can determine whether or not that traffic should be passed during certain times of the day. That's what schedules allow us to do. So it's essentially a useful feature because there are times whereby you may want to restrict traffic to specific ports on specific subnets or access to certain subnets. The way you do it would be through schedules. So let's take a look at the interface. Let's say we restrict access to RDP, which is one of our most recent rules. Let's say during certain windows of time. So let's see what's currently the configuration. So as we look here, we can take a look at firewall rules, see what's in place. We've got a bunch of rules. So we've got 3389. This is from anyone in the 750/24 subnet to a specific host of 1.104 for 3389. Let's see if that node's up. And it's responding affirmatively. Now, we did say we don't have an RDP client, but telnet is enough for us to be able to determine whether or not things work. So a quick telnet to say 192.168.1.104 3389 should respond, and it has responded. So that looks good. That tells us that the port's available as it currently stands. Now, in terms of these schedules, let's see how we can interface with them. Navigate to firewall schedules. Currently none are defined. First, you define schedules as separate abstract objects, and those objects can be tied to different rules. So let's just note that it does add criteria to a basic rule, and they are, and that's of course a schedule, separate objects that can be tied to various rules. So they do stand alone and are tied only when necessary. So the idea is to come up with a range of time for either passing or blocking traffic. So let's say create block of time to either pass or deny traffic or reject. Same difference, deny, reject, etc. So in terms of time, it'll be based on the firewall's view of time. So this is why it's good to use a common time such as UTC to avoid any confusion. So here's how we add a block. Let's say we call this RDP block. Let's say blocks access to RDP during certain windows, whatever those windows happen to be, or during certain times. So blocks access to RDP. So restricted on characters. Now, in terms of blocking off the time, you specify by highlighting the date that's of interest. So currently, this is where we are. If you highlight the header, it blocks all of the days in a particular month across all of the months. So let's say you navigate to August, you'll see that it's blocked off accordingly. So the current month is in focus, but by highlighting the column header, that particular day is selected. By highlighting the individual date, for example, such as the 9th, then you'll see it's just for that particular month and applies to no other month. So you can selectively indicate which days should be blocked or hours that should be blocked across all days if necessary. You can block all days by selecting all of the days of the week. So let's say Monday through Sunday, maybe access should be denied between certain hours. To confirm the current time insofar as the firewall is concerned, just have a look at the dashboard. That'll give you a sense as to current information. with respect to time. So it sees the time as the following, 1807 and July 15th. And this actually is the last config change. The current date time is July 16, 1506. So we want to block time. Let's say maybe we do it 1500 hours to 1600 hours. So that'll apply across the board. So supposing that's our maintenance window. So we just simply picked an hour, 1500 hours to start, and maybe stop 1600 hours. Or maybe 15, since it's about 1506, maybe 1510 or 1515 or something along those lines. This will give us a 15-minute window to administer the system. So maintenance window for RDP, whatever that means. It could be, let's say, adding updates or applying updates to those systems that have RDP. So that'll create that block for us, and we'll see maintenance window for RDP, which is currently not applied to any of the firewall rules. Input were detected. A schedule name may only consist of the following characters. So let's say we make this RDP hyphen block and try it again. Click on save. And A through Z actually doesn't take a hyphen, so RDP block. So we'll do it this way. Let's see if it takes it this time. And this time it takes it. So there's our RDP block, 1500 through 1515. And currently, let's do a refresh here. It's rather straightforward, 1507. So we've got 8 minutes for this rule to apply. Now, it's not tied to a firewall rule. We'll have to take a look at rules, firewall rules, and modify the criteria associated with 3389. So let's edit this. There's a whole section below for rules in the advanced features area, which covers different criteria that may be applied to rules. So just navigate to the schedule area. You can even tweak the rule based on gateways and other criteria. Navigate to advanced and associate the lone rule that's associated or that's published, the lone schedule that's published. That's the RDP block rule. And then click on save, and that'll become effective. If you'll take a look at schedule rules now, you'll see that RDP block is set. Now note that it's set to pass traffic 1500 through 1515. So whereas the default, what we want is to block traffic. So let's just double check to see how it's currently working. Let's try to telnet into it. Notice that it's allowing us, despite the fact that it is 1500 through 1515. So it's actually allowing the traffic to pass. So let's take a look at the schedule itself to see if there are any hints. Let's go back to firewall schedules, RDP block, and edit the rule itself. So we have it labeled as blocks access to a particular port. So what we're looking for is to see whether or not the rule has inherent in it the ability to block. So notice none of the fields here specify that it should block access. Let's click on edit, maintenance window. The most you can do is just change the window and reassign it. So that leads us to believe that the blockage, insofar as the time is concerned, is associated with the rule itself as opposed to the schedule. So have a look here again and leave as none to leave the rule enabled all the time, which means that it's always enabled. Well, that means if we're allowed to pass traffic between this time frame of 1500 to 1515 hours, that means the rule should be changed to block. So let's take a look again at firewall rules just to get a perspective. So essentially this rule should be blocked between that time, since that access time is currently set to pass. So we can change the rule to block by editing it and selecting block or reject. And then this will block during that time as opposed to passing during that time as per the criteria. And let's just confirm that it's going to be blocked. Let's make sure we apply the changes. So now you can see RDP block is set to block during that time. And outside of that time, it'll permit access. So let's try it again. Now you see we can't telnet into 3389. Now how do we know this is working? If we adjust the schedule itself, we should be able to confirm whether or not it's working. So let's go back to firewall, modify the schedule for RDP block, and shift the time from maybe 1515 to something else. Now notice, this is actually set to all the time schedules. This is a problem. Let's set this to 15. Actually, that's the default, that is. So we navigate to this and edit this. This is what we want, 1515. So 15 to 1515. So let's say we set this to 14 hours to maybe 1430 hours or something along those lines, which have already passed GMT-wise. And this will add the time, and we'll save the changes. So 14 to 1430 as opposed to 15 to 1515. So the schedule has been updated. Now let's take a look at the firewall rules once again to see where we are. So the new schedule is in effect. Let's see whether or not we can telnet by creating a new session over to 104. And let's see if it's applied. So it's actually set to block. Let's go ahead and modify this to set it to pass traffic except for that time range. Let's click on save here. And let's see. So it's going to pass traffic but block it except for that time. So now let's try to connect again and see if it allows through. Actually, let's make sure we apply the changes. This hasn't been applied. That's the problem. Let's kill that and try it again. Give it a little bit to refresh the change on the firewall. And let's take a look. There's probably a block rule in place. Let's take a look at our rule set here. So RDP block, that looks good. Actually, here's a rule at the top that snuck in. Easy rule blocked from firewall log food. This is causing a problem. So let's get rid of this. This is stopping all traffic coming in to the subnet. So let's kill that, apply the changes and try this again. Close that out. Again, that's likely to cause confusion. Let's give it a bit to refresh. Let's also try this on the 192.168.75.433.89, which is the external address. And it's still not permitting access through. Let's see what's happening if anything else is in the way. So this is just Bogon nets. That looks good. And 3389 should be allowed through 14 through 1430. So let's see what it's doing. Is working as expected because it's actually blocking the traffic unless it's a given time range. Let's just double check that. So as you can see, RDP block 14 to 1430. It looks a bit confusing because it seems as if it'll only block during those times, but essentially this criteria applied to this rule says unless it's 14 to 1430, block the traffic. So we can extend that by modifying the schedule to open up the traffic. Let's go ahead and edit that just to illustrate. So let's say we edit this to a time frame such as 14 to 1630, which will cover our current time. We'll add this time and save it, and then apply the rule. That should be fine. We don't need to reload the configuration. And notice it connects now. So what's happening here is firewall rules. So essentially, the traffic is allowed to pass currently because we're in the time frame. But if we're not in the time frame, it's blocked. So if we modify this again to say the time that we recently specified, which is 14 to 1430, let's do that again just to further illustrate. It's a little confusion on it. So let's say this is our maintenance window, 14 to 1430. Let's save the changes. This will now change to a block rule automatically because we're not within that time frame. So now it's a block. So in order to permit traffic outside of this, you'll need another rule that allows traffic. So you need to, so essentially top down, the first rule that hits matches. So if you fall within the time range, it blocks. That's currently the time range. So if we don't, or in this case, since we don't fall in the time range, it doesn't pass the traffic. So the thing to do is to have another rule. So if we have another rule that backs this rule up, we can block during a certain time frame and then pass it during other time frames. So again, because we're not within the certain time frame, it blocks it. So either we change this to a block rule during that time frame and then include a pass rule. That's probably the logical way to do it. So for example, let's say we add another rule based on this rule. So we're going to pass TCP 3389 without a schedule. This will be next on the list. So here we see it's the next rule. So what will happen is this will be changed to a block rule. So we're going to make sure that we change that to a block rule. Let's go ahead and actually we just disabled it. Let's modify that to enable it again. We want that to be a block rule during that particular time window so that users can't access it. So let's block it or reject, denying the connection. And then we'll apply the changes. So what will happen now is during the hours of this schedule, 14 to 1430, RDP traffic will be blocked. Top down, the rules are red. This will be captured first, or this will match first. Otherwise, the next rule will be to pass 3389, which will work outside of this schedule. Remember, there's an implicit default deny at the end of firewall rules. So as it currently stands at 2 rules, we'll fix the situation. So let's see what's happening now. 14 to 1430. And let's kill this, try to kill this session here. So oftentimes with the schedules, you end up creating two rules. Maybe we'll just telnet from another window just to make expedite. So let's try to telnet from this window, 192.168.1.104.33.89. Notice it allows us through, and that's what's expected. So again, just to reiterate, when this window is met, 14 to 1430, there will be a block. And when the window is not met, then this rule will simply be ignored. So it switches the criteria if the time is met, if the time is current. So currently, it doesn't meet that particular criteria, so it blocks the rule. So you assign these schedules to block accordingly, and you can back them up with two rules if necessary. So if we wanted this to block, we'd just extend the window as we just recently did, and it would block accordingly. So now that we've switched the general rule to a block, let's modify the schedule to overlap our current time frame. So let's say we edit this and make it 14 to 1630, which will cover our current time frame. We'll add the time and save the changes, then navigate back to Firewall Rules, and let's see what's happening now. So this is currently set to block. It's 14 to 1630 as it currently is, and that rule should trap it first. Let's see what's happening here if this one's released the connection. And now it's blocking it because it encompasses the current time frame. So again, as the rules are read top down, this rule matches first because of the criteria associated with this schedule, and it blocks us. If the schedule is altered and it falls out of scope, then the next rule is processed, which permits 3389. So in this case, we have a double rule. So we can modify this again just to put it back to what we expect outside of our maintenance window. Let's edit this rule. We'll just make it 14 to 1430. Typically, your maintenance windows will be other times, but nonetheless, it correlates to what we're currently doing. So now, Firewall Rules, this RDP block, it'll block it, but it doesn't fall within the scope, so now we're allowed to connect. So you can tweak on your ports, tweak various traffic. We just select any given port to maybe cut off terminal services access as a common feature set. And to just be sure that we're able to access it, let's just do a search quickly for MS RDP Mac client. This should get us from Microsoft the latest client. But of course, if we're able to telnet to the port, that should do what we need. And we want this to be in English. So let's do google.com MSRDP Mac client. And let's get something that pulls it in. This is a Chrome web, so we don't want this one. This is RDP client from Windows desktop. We want it from Mac. So let's see what our search reads. MSRDP Mac client. You can get it from the iTunes store or directly from Microsoft. Let's pull it from here. This is probably the same version. We'll double check that. So let's pull this in, 211. That should be fine. It's a little bit older, but that'll serve our intents and purposes. So just a little confusing on the schedule because of the current time and the fact that we didn't have a backup rule, and that the implicit rule is a deny. So that's the expected behavior. Let's see what this is doing here. Security preferences. So let's fix that. And we'll allow that from anywhere. Just for now, just to get this installed. That should be on momentarily. And of course, conversely, you could rewrite the rule to allow traffic to pass during time frames as well, blocking it outside of it with the implicit deny, which is what we saw originally, which caused the confusion. So you could open up RDP for a specific window by just modifying the original rule, the pass rule, setting it to pass traffic during the window where it's permissible. And these sorts of rules may be applicable to VPNs. Perhaps you allow VPNs during certain time windows. And let's see what's happening here. It's taking a little bit longer. We'll kill out some of these windows, just free up some resources, and then we'll move on. But again, this is a neat feature to have. You can define your schedules as you see fit. You just block the times off, and you can maintain different schedules. Just block them as you see fit. Maybe all Sundays a certain rule should apply. So maybe this is backup, network backup, or something along those lines. And maybe during the wee hours of the morning, so 0 hours through maybe 4 hours into 5 hours, backup. And this becomes a separate, unassociated schedule. Then you can determine which of your rules are to include this time range. So just have a look at rules and then determine perhaps which of these should be disabled. Let's see what this is doing. This is running some scripts, so we should be in the clear momentarily. We'll be able to use that. But factor these schedules in to your firewall rules. Again, as we've mentioned, there are a number of criteria you may associate with your firewall rules. For example, we've mentioned that pF has the ability to determine the source operating system and block traffic accordingly. That's a nice feature to have. Let's resecure our environment by telling it the Mac App Store and identified developers, just to make things a little more secure. And we want to open RDC anyway. This was an earlier pop-up. And then we should be able to click lock since it's already installed. We should see a link to it in our desktop somewhere. And there's the remote desktop connection. Let's try to connect to that node. And either IP should work. We just had a little confusion surrounding the time. And that looks good. That looks like it's allowing us to connect. And that's a certificate, self-signed certificate. That's fine. So this gives us the RDP session. And again, it would block the session if the schedule matched accordingly. Let's kill this session. At this point, we don't need it. So we'll disconnect. That's just a network pop-up. We'll save it. That's fine. So you have other criteria as we've mentioned. You can specify source OS. So if it finds Windows coming in, you can block connections or non-Windows systems into RDP base resources, although you could have RDP clients on any platform, so that shouldn't be an issue. And based on gateways, for example, so etc. But we'll just cancel this. We don't want to apply it at this particular point. So we just want to show you that you could define some simple schedule criteria, sometimes not so simple. Sometimes it requires that you double up your rules in order to permit traffic to flow. And again, as we've said, the converse of this would be to pass traffic. So switching this block to a pass only during certain windows and then leaving the default or the implicit deny at the end to trap all other time frames, which is what we saw originally. So create a block of time, and let's just note, be careful not to block traffic as we did via schedules. In other words, ensure that time range allows traffic to pass. Otherwise, the implicit deny or default deny will block traffic, as we saw. So as it currently stands, just to recap, the first rule will block traffic between the hours of 14 and 14:30, and a more realistic schedule might be during maintenance windows. And the next will allow the traffic to pass, but because firewall rules are usually read top-down, the first one will only meet the criteria during the hours of 14 and 14:30, and the second will meet the criteria during all other hours, and that should be fine. You could even have a schedule for the pass that is the opposite or the converse of this schedule. So outside of the hours of 14 through 14:30, you could allow traffic to pass, and that would match. So you'd have two rules, one that blocks, one that passes the traffic otherwise, because again, bearing in mind that there's always the default deny that's implicit at the bottom of each of these firewall rules. So let's move on.